welcome to 10 Very Big Books, a Malazan read-through podcast. My name is Peter Bond, and with me today on the show is Andy Smith. Hello and welcome to the show.
Hello, I am so pumped to be here.
We're glad to have you. If you don't know Andy, he makes booktube videos. He makes YouTube videos about other books as well, but he makes a lot of Malazan videos, and he's a part of the community. He's out there talking to a lot of people, doing a lot of stuff.
If you've seen anything, I'm probably the postmodern Malazan guy. That's probably like my claim to fame.
That's how your first foray onto the scene, for sure.
Yes, yep.
How you doing today, Andy?
I am doing very good. I'm full of the Olympic spirit, so I'm hoping that you'll give me a gold medal in Malazan podcasting.
Sure. What event were you watching?
So it's midday here while we're recording this, so it's all the kind of weird shit that's on in the middle of the day. So far today I've watched 7-on-7 rugby, a couple of volleyball matches, archery, and handball. I'm really an Olympic whore. I don't know if that's is that a saying people say?
You're an equal opportunity employer.
Yep, just everything. I'll watch it all. I literally watch curling during the Winter Olympics. So
curling rules. Although I've never curled, and it seems like it'd be a lot of fun.
There's a local curling club here. I'm in Minnesota, and they do events every month in the winter called Cocktails and Curling, which sounds like the best time ever, but I still have not had any time to do it. But one day.
So as you can tell today on the show, we are discussing the Bone Hunters in context of the whole series. So we're going to spoil the Book of the Fallen, the 10 books, the 10 very big books, if you will. So if you're not interested in hearing the discussion of Book 6 with spoilers, then you came to the wrong show.
Get out.
So that's that. And now AJ will play some polite music, and then we will begin the spoilers. Wow, how about those 10 books? We sure have read them, haven't you?
Crippled God.
Crippled God,
etc.
He's Kamen Sod. He's around,
which means nothing, even if you finished it. The name Kamen Sod is just, I guess. It's
I like. Sometimes I think people act like that's a big spoiler, but I guess the spoiler is he has a name.
Yeah, seriously, you could have told me that before Gardens of the Moon. I've been like, whoa, and by the end it means nothing.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess I kind of like it, but.
Yeah, it's a cool fact, but it's not a big spoiler. I will say, since we're talking about spoilers of the whole series, I was thinking about my Bone Hunters reading experience today and the whole series as a whole, and it is interesting thinking back on the series that Bone Hunters is really where Erikson starts to make the turn to the long con, right? Because we've heard about the Crippled God and like the shitty stuff he does. The first time I remember putting it together is Memories of Ice, that there's someone behind the tennis gallery and all this terrible stuff. And
well, in Memories of Ice, they introduced the Crippled God, and it's just I've read a book before senses go off.
It's the big guy. That's the Thanos, right?
Exactly. You're like, okay, so that's the thing, and then also this is 2010, so I know there's 10 books, and I know that's the name of the 10th one. So you're like, maybe this is the start of this trajectory.
Exactly. And then in the House of Chains, that expands again because we find out that the horrible thing of the whirlwind was also somewhat inspired by the Crippled God. Midnight Tides, you start to get a little more with the whole mottled sword. So you're like, and then in Bone Hunters, it's like, oh, this shitty, horrible guy is behind all the terrible shit in the world. And it starts to kind of come together and you think, okay, now they're going to go, defeat this guy. And then of course the long con is that the whole thing is they're going to go show compassion on this guy, and that's actually how to defeat evil. But Bone Hunters really is that starts to solidify, which I think is kind of it really is a big hinge point for the rest of the series.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because Kamen Sod and the Crippled God stuff itself, I mean, I agree with most of what you said, but as opposed to books, because not that much Crippled God stuff in 2. To my memory,
we don't know about it. It's revealed in House of Chains that the whole whirlwind god is orchestrated by him and mistreated, kind of thing. But Red House Gate's not really. But
I agree with you saying that his emergence into the scene kind of climaxes in this introductory half in the 5th book, where I don't know, there's 4 or 5, 6 scenes with him where he's talking, has all these monologues, and it grows from 3, 4, 5. But from my mind, there's not a scene with him in the 6th book, and basically we're more dealing with proxy actors for the crippled god than dealing with him ourselves. So it is kind of interesting how he drops off a bit. But I do agree with this, and this is one of my main memories of reading book 6, is it's the first time I was like, okay, I get it. Like, I get what we're doing here, you know? Like, I like, and it essentially happened when, in the second half of the book, when the Eater kind of show up in the story.
Yep.
Like, you learn that Carson and Ikariam are going to go to Lether, and then I don't know if I put together the Malazans were probably going to end, the Bone Hunters were going to end up on Lether, but I was just so shocked. And I was like, okay, we're all going to go to Lether. This is what the book's about. Like, yep. I hadn't put it together or anything, but it was my first sense of momentum that like all of these pieces were one day going to intersect.
Yeah, and I think for me, the big like light going off in that, the light never fully goes off because again, it's Malazan, but like when Karsa is like willingly goes with who you figure out eventually is the Tista Eater, and you find out, oh, this Emperor taking challenges, oh, that's Rulat. Like that is where it's like everything's coming together. Like, yeah, like you said, pointing towards this next stage, which I think is, yeah, that's the really cool part, that second half after Yucatan, where that starts to become apparent. And then obviously it continues in Reaper's Gale when we actually get to Lether. So,
looking back on it, now that we stumbled into that point, looking back on it, what do you make of Bone Hunters? Where do you position it in the series as a whole? It's definitely this kind of transitionary book. I wonder what you think about it and where you place it in your mind's eye.
I think probably like upper middle class, so to speak. So I'm like a huge fan of the more ponderous Malazan side of things. Like Toll the Hounds and Crippled God are definitely like
Toll the Hounds, shout out, best book.
Toll the Hounds is so good. I love it. I'm really interested when you guys get there how India is going to enjoy the thoughts on redemption and navel gazing of the Tist.
I have to tell you, my gut feeling is none of my co-hosts will like Toll the Hounds. That is that is my gut feeling, but I'll be on the show. So
fight the good fight, because definitely they're going to hate Namander, because everyone does.
Listen, even I am not a huge Namander fan, but anyway, so you were talking, you prefer the ponderous one.
Oh, yeah. So Crippled God and Toll the Hounds are definitely like up there for me. And then sort of the next level for me is kind of the Bone Hunters Memories of Ice, because they're still ponderous, right? Everything is ponderous in this series, but they also do have like a heart of kind of like action and things happening. Same with Dead House Gates. Like there's a push of plot, just like there's a push of plot here. But because of Yucatan, the Poliel stuff, and like the Malaz City stuff at the end, we have 3 really, really solid action set pieces. I don't know about action, but like plot set pieces, kind of puts it at that next level after my favorites.
But how do you conceptualize the book as its role? I mean, I guess here's what I'm getting at. So I agree. I think I've been thinking a lot about the book, as you could imagine. And I feel this weird sense of like maybe it doesn't work, you know? And like I like the book a fair amount. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But like, what even is the book? You know, I guess that's how I feel. Like, what is this?
I mean, is that part of that, like, I think Steve said on this program or maybe somewhere else, like the whole, like, it's 2 books kind of thing. Do you think that just doesn't work?
Yeah, part of me thinks that it just kind of doesn't work in that regard. Exactly. I mean, listen, and it's kind of paradoxical because all of the individual parts I actually think are really great. Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah. I like all of the storylines, and then there's these awesome set pieces. I actually think the climax of this book is like kind of a shrug for me. I don't really care about the Malaz City stuff, but it's solid. I enjoy it, you know. But then, like when I think about the book altogether, I don't really feel like it coheres into something, you know. Like at the end of Midnight Tides, at the end of Toll the Hounds, at the end of Memories of Ice, not only are there these climaxes, but also there's a thematic cohesion in the story. Where I feel like in Bone Hunters, like there's some stuff that binds all of it together, but mostly I feel like it's a bunch of stuff that happens. That's all really cool stuff. And I like all of it. But I do think it's missing a certain core for me.
Well, I think so. Before I said it's kind of a linchpin for the series in the sense of it pivots a lot of stuff, which is a positive way of saying it. A negative way of saying that is that it doesn't really do anything on its own. It's just sort of serving a function, and I could definitely see that. Like when I think of Bone Hunters, I just think of the Yucatan stuff. Like that's where my mind goes immediately. And then I'm a huge Ganos Perrin fan, so like I think of the Poliel stuff because that's where he starts actually being like cool instead of just
he's like a guy.
Yeah. He's not sad boy. He's like becoming his ascendant self that eventually he is in Crippled God. So like those are the things I think of with Crippled God, not, as you said, sort of a cohesive thing, where all the other ones, I think if you'd said something, except maybe House of Chains, because I'm not a huge House of Chains fan, but like, which I know is a controversial opinion in 10 Very Big Books land. But
not a controversial opinion for me.
Well, doesn't everybody else like love House of Chains? Didn't India really like House of Chains?
My co-host liked that book more than me, but yeah.
At the moment, we'll see. But like the other books, like they do something, right? Like again, Memories of Ice is like, oh yeah, it's the tennis gallery and dealing with, blah, blah. Deadhouse Gates, Coltane, blah. Like all of this like has cohesive stuff, kind of standalone on its own. And Bone Hunters for me really isn't like that. It's like, I remember Yucatan is cool, but yeah, besides that, it's like getting the chess pieces in place for the final 4 books.
Which, like, it's one of those things. I'm not trying to, like...
Not bashing the book.
Yeah, it's like, sure, I don't know. Things got to move around. There's like a billion pieces in it. I don't think it's the worst thing. I certainly don't think it's the worst book. I think other books manage to convey a type of profound emotion to me, and I don't feel that way about, at the end of this book, I just feel like I've learned a lot of what has happened to these people.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've already said are Toll the Hounds fans, so I think we're in a very particular sect of the Malazan community overall that kind of likes that ponderous stuff there, and there is less of that in the Bone Hunters. The most interesting part, and maybe to ask you a question, that I think there's an interesting reflection on the whole revolution or rebellion or shit show, whatever you want to call Deadhouse Gates and House of Chains. I think Kalam and Quickben actually have a discussion about this. Like, what were we doing here? And I think
whether it was all for naught.
Yeah. I think that's the most interesting sort of reflection that happens in this book. And for a little bit, Cotillion also does that sort of when he's talking to Sari or Apsalar about like trying to like create this friendship or mentorship or whatever the weird stuff, like relationship he has with her, is sort of reflecting back on what he has done. But there isn't as much of that as in like even a Reaper's Gale or Toll the Hounds, which is, as we have said, some of our favorites.
Which, to be honest, isn't a negative. I mean, I enjoy Toll the Hounds, but criticizing it for being too navel-gazy and like just up its own ass, I think is a super fair criticism. And, I don't know. Of course, there are times when I don't enjoy the ruminations, However, like, I don't think this is the secret to writing a great book, But I do think the ruminations in the book are pretty good. I think some of the conversation, this is, I would say, the start of Karsa and Samar having great conversations. Obviously, because Samar's introduced in this book. But I don't know. It's just, I don't know if I would have liked it more if there were more ruminations.
Let me ask you this. Speaking of ruminations, I'm just curious. This is kind of, I said on my video with Brittany from Books with Brittany when we went over this, like, this is kind of the end of the Seven Cities trilogy.
Yeah.
So looking back on this is your second or third reread?
Second.
So like, what are your like Seven Cities?
Well, it's my first reread.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah. Yes. Language and all that. So this is your first time doing this. Like looking back on Seven Cities, I'm curious now, like what you think of that episode in this series. Like there's so much to go on there as far as like, you're kind of rooting for the Empire, but it feels wrong to do the Empire, but the rebellion is so bad and violent. And I don't know. I'm just curious, looking back on the whole of the Seven Cities trilogy, what really stands out to you?
Interesting question. I guess I am a big fan of the Seven Cities stuff in general. What I like is I like the diversity and setting. I think, honestly, Lether walks away and Colance walk away being the most boring of the settings for me. I think both Genabacchus and Seven Cities are places I feel like I know very well. and that I enjoy going back and forth between those settings. They both have really different things to offer. So I enjoy the setting a lot. Book 2 is, I think, one of the great books in the series. And I think book 6 is definitely one of the stronger ones. So I feel like some pretty good books are set here. As for I guess the central storyline that occupies some of it, yeah, I think it's very interesting. I forget when. I think we were talking about in Dead House Gates. I don't know. It's like kind of a place of ascension, and of course, we first encounter this through the Bridge Burners, and now we encounter it later on through the Bone Hunters. And it's kind of this place for people to transcend themselves, Coltane. And I think that's interesting. And I enjoy it as this place to kind of push people. Yeah, I have some other thoughts, but I wonder what you make of it looking back on those 3 books.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of go to my bread and butter, sort of the idea of postmodernism and broadly thinking of how different perspectives illustrate how we view history and how we interpret history. And I think the Seven Cities storyline is so fascinating because it doesn't just tell us what happens there, but it tells us about the interpretation of it from multiple sides and how it changes the course of history in unusual ways and is maneuvered in unusual ways. Because like in Dead House Gates, we get, so to speak, the facts, in quotes. I guess this is a podcast, so I have to show my quotes. Like what happens, right? Coltane, he's a hero, blah, 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 blah. But there's still some tension there because we don't root for the Empire, so to speak, because we know the Malazan Empire has some pretty negative aspects, but also the rebellion is incredibly violent, crucifying kids, like horrific things. So it's like this complete terrible shit show as war often is. And that's kind of Dead House Gates, right? There's no real winners in Dead House Gates. Everyone loses. And then House of Chains, we kind of see the outpouring of that and how different aspects of the continent have interpreted what happened in RN and all this sort of stuff. And then in the 6th one, we kind of see people using that in various forms to justify what they're doing, whether it's the Wiccans getting killed in Malaz Island or in the Malazan Empire, like there's a culling happening there, whether it's Malik Rel now grabbing power and making it sound like the Empire, Coltane was a traitor. I love the fascinating elements of in Malazan. You don't just get the cool shit, which often happens in fantasy. You get like the way that history affects everything in various ways, sometimes not even truthfully. And depending on where you are, how you receive information, completely changes how you view certain things. Like it'd be like, I don't know, if we got like what the Northern Kingdoms thought of the War of the Ring and Lord of the Rings, and they actually thought Frodo was like a bad guy because he didn't give the Ring of Power. I don't know. I'm kind of going off the rails here, but like I love that is an aspect of specifically the Seven Cities storyline and Malazan as a whole. Did that make sense? Was that coherent?
Yeah, it makes total sense. And I think, as you said before, the frames in which we view the things is manipulating them and drawing attention to them is something common throughout the series.
Yep.
Now, to touch on another point, I wonder what you think of it. How do you think these books on Seven Cities shade the Malazan Empire as colonizers and their goal to colonize the continent?
That is like the eternal hard question, right? Because at one side, we are programmed to root for the Malazan Empire because it's called the Malazan Book of the Fallen. We know the most Malazan characters. And if we're being honest with ourselves, most of the people who read this come from colonized country backgrounds. I don't know if most, I think probably at this point still most, right? It's probably still mostly read in the Western world.
Do you mean countries that
that have a history of colonization? So like,
okay, sure.
I'm a American.
I get you.
Yeah. So I'm programmed to sort of even automatically be for the bigger empire that is bringing peace and prosperity and democracy, so to speak. And so like it's hard for me to look past that because if I'm being honest, I rooted for the Malazans as I'm reading that in all of the books. But I don't think Erickson wants us to get off that easy because as we found out in Bone Hunters, like they're completely manipulative, and the whole thing with the culling of the Wiccans, like it's the same sort of shit. It's just being done in a different way. I'm kind of rambling here because I don't know if there's a great answer to that question. So I'm gonna ask you the same question. How do you think the
Well, it's a tough question.
Yeah.
I put you to it. And I think to me it's a somewhat tough question because for me it's an uncomfortable answer. I think you're right, and I think that the book is somewhat stacked in the favor of the Malazans. And I think when I was younger, I think I kind of unthinkingly just thought it would be good if the Malazans won, and that was that, and boom, boom, boom. And I think I now feel more queasy about it. And I certainly agree. I think not only in House of Chains, there are both sides presented more, but even in that conflict, I think the book gives you reasons to like the Empire and reasons not to like the Rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like you walk away feeling like it was good that the Empire won or something like this. So I don't know. I feel fairly conflicted about it, and not that the book could be pro this and it could still be a fine book. I just would disagree with it. But I think I don't know. I was just curious what you thought. I think it's something I think about with the Empire in general, because I think in general the books are somewhat just stacked in favor of the Malazan Empire.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I mean, and again, getting back to like the interesting part of history, like I think it's tempting whenever we read fantasy because it's in an ancient context, like technologically for the most part. We think that some of the points they're making in these aspects are potentially just historical. But I mean, so hopefully this is not getting too real, but I mean, again, as an American, I think about the war in Iraq of 2003, right?
I think about that all the time. So.
Yeah, like it's like Saddam Hussein was a really bad guy, just like the rebellion. The leaders were bad guys that crucified children or abused, chemical weapons on their people. But I don't think either that the answer is that a large empire that is also full of criminals and people doing terrible things to invade, to steal resources from that area, like that's not right either. And so it's these really tough. I mean, it's a real world issue that Erickson is masterfully giving us multiple sides, and also as much as we are primed to be with the Malazans, understanding that we are, as you said, hopefully uncomfortable with that. I think if we're reading the books, I shouldn't say reading the books right. I think my interpretation of it is that you should be uncomfortable with that. Yeah,
I mean, I don't think I say the books are stacked in the favor of the Malazans, but I don't think the books are uncomplicated about it. And
I think that's a good way to say it.
Yeah, and I don't think part of that, just part of how I feel, is simply the fact that I don't know, 50% of the perspectives of the books are from Malazan soldiers. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
So this just, I think, inherently is going to give you some biases towards the soldiers of Empire, However, going against that, of course, I think the idea that the Empire is some good, benevolent force, I think is not really, the idea that the book is saying that is a farce. Do you know what I mean? Yep. So, of course, it is fairly, I think the book in general is it's tough. We're really just swimming in it, but let's keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think the series in general is fairly skeptical of power and those who wield it. And so that those who wield power in the Empire, I think, are generally positioned as bad people, or usually they get away looking pretty bad. However, man, we're really into it. So one time on the Discord, this is about Bone Hunters, I guess. One time on the Discord, I said that part of the reason I feel like the book ends up being somewhat pro-Empire or pro-imperialism is because don't you feel that Kellanved is ultimately proved kind of right?
That is interesting. I mean, I guess it depends if you think Kellanved continued with his imperialism, or is his giving up of the Empire his giving up of that particular thing? You know what I mean? Like there's that, what is the decision to ascend? Is that him expanding his imperialism to now go to the supernatural, or is that him recognizing that there's limitations to that, and that what brings him to this act of compassion with Kamisat? Or yeah, that's right. I'm getting my K's mixed up. That I think is a very interesting question, because the opposite of that answer is that Tavor, for her to eventually be proved right, which she was, is she had to go against Empire, and really by the end, the Bone Hunters are basically a nationless force of like good. You know what I mean? Like that by the end, they are Malazans, but also kind of aren't. And I guess it's how you interpret that. It comes out with how you think about the imperialist propaganda or point that potentially is or isn't being made. Did that make sense?
I mostly followed you. I mean, I guess in my mind, I view Kellanved, I somewhat feel like the books believe, I was talking about how skeptical the books are about leaders in Empire, right? Which I think it fairly is. I think most of these leaders get painted as bad people. And I think the reason I brought up Kellanved there is because I somewhat feel like if Kellanved was still in charge of the Empire, I think Kellanved is like painted as a cool, good guy, you know? I think he's painted as a wild, crazy dude who like you can't trust and like you don't know what he's doing. But I don't think the book is like, oh yeah, here's this dude who led an imperial effort to colonize half of the world, you know?
Yeah.
Which to me is like something a bad person would do.
Yeah.
You know, but I don't feel like the book is that skeptical of Kellanved or Cotillion. I think the books are fairly reverent of those two characters. And then on top of that, then in the end, they end up, in my mind, being proven that, like, well, they've given up so much, they've made so many tough decisions, and it was for a good reason, and they were right. Which makes me ultimately feel like the book kind of sides with them.
I think that's a good point. I don't think that's so fascinating, especially because the first time you meet those two characters, they're literally slaughtering hundreds of innocent people with hounds on the shores of Kontali. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So like there is those parts that shows like those bad things, but I think you're probably right. I mean, coming out of the books, you do have a positive view of Kellanved to a lesser extent. For me, the like one that is shown to be like, I don't know, good is the right, but like Cotillion kind of takes a lot of the virtue in my eyes and in my reading, which is not to say it's any better, but
I definitely agree. Cotillion's painted as the more likable of the two.
Yeah, he's sort of the one I think keeping the reins. It seems like Cotillion's kind of going nuts. Kellanved's going kind of nuts. Who knows if that's actually like real, because Kellanved is so hard to get a read on. But I think that's a really valid point of like, is the Julius Caesar of this world, you know, the guy who won in the end, is he the virtuous one? I don't know.
No, and listen, it's tough because in this big conversation about if the books are endorsing the Malazan Empire, it's like somewhat trying to be binary about it. And ultimately, I do think, as I've said, I think the Malazan Empire doesn't get away painted in some brilliant white light. I mean, there's lots of sections about how bad the Malazan Empire is, you know. But I've always felt a little queasy about it, and maybe more in the Seven Cities stuff than the Genabaka stuff. And I think maybe that's just because the Seven Cities stuff reminds me of American politics in my lifetime.
Yeah,
you brought up the Iraq War. I think about it all. I think about those wars all the time when I read these books. So.
100%, and like that's just in our lifetime, right? If we look at the whole history of the United States, we can go from
exactly, and that's why I'm just
Korea.
I'm just 100%. I'm just aware of those. Like, it's just a temporal bias of like when I was alive, I grew. You know what I mean? But
yeah. But that's why I think to the positive side of this thing, I think you do feel that gross thing. I think that's a huge and amazing strength of these books.
100% agree.
What other fantasy series do all your main heroes adhere to a system of power that you are unsure about, or at least that you are shown to be unsure about, right? They're always like the good nation, right? It's always Gondor, or it's I don't know. I was trying to think of what the name of the Stormlight Archive series is, but anyway, like it's always like the good guys. And
you're killing me. I can remember it. Oh my god. There's too many names. Keep going. I'll let you know.
The Dalinar is a guy.
I wanted to say Dalinar too, but that's the dude's name.
Yeah. What are they from?
I forget. I really forget.
I read these in the fall. I should know this.
I picked up
Roshar.
No, that's the world's name. That's the world's name.
Oh, fuck, you're right.
Is it? I wanted to say Lether. God. Look.
The light-eyed people.
Let's move on.
Oh my gosh. I could rip. Never mind. We're not gonna go on a Stormlight rant.
Do you know what? After the credits, we'll talk Stormlight for a sec. But so here's the thing. I agree. Like I sometimes, which is apparent on the show, I sometimes don't agree with the politics of these books. Which is fine. And the idea that I should like the politics of everything I read is somewhat silly. Of course, I don't believe that. But I think I enjoy that the books are engaged with this type of stuff and that are more openly grappling with the moral morass of this type of violence and this type of structural effort, So I certainly don't think it's some, terrible thing. And I just think it's something worthy of discussion, And I certainly think some of the writing about this stuff has made me think about it in my real life and our world and our history, which to me is a good thing. So although I feel uneasy about some of the politics about this or other stuff in the series, I don't walk away feeling like, damn you.
It's one of the things that makes Malazan unique and a good experience, but it's not the same thing as finishing, I don't know, fill in the blank book and being like, they did it. Our heroes did it. It's just not the same, and that's how I think the real world, it should be, I should say. Most people don't think about things that way, but I think that is the right way to think about them.
Yeah, not only do I feel like the books are engaged with these issues, I also don't think I'm reading The Fountainhead, where it's just like, yeah, exactly.
Bashing you over the head with shit. Sorry, Ayn Rand fans.
Boom. Fountainhead call out. But
Fountainhead blown.
I think it's good. It's nice. It's nice. I've like I think what it is especially since and we're going to talk Witness pretty soon. So we both just finished reading The God Is Not Willing. So we're going to make a podcast about that. And I was reading it, and I told you I was trying to get this book done before summer vacation. I'm camping, and I was like, I was just reading so much Malazan, and when you enter like the book cocoon, and you're just like thinking about all these thoughts, and like I was thinking so much about the politics of these books and how they're structured, and then different stuff, and I was like, man. But now I just feel this huge sense of catharsis being able to talk about it, and it's like, what a relief.
Yep, no, I completely 100% agree. Especially it's hard with Malazan because, like, you can't really talk about Malazan without someone who's somewhat read it or is aware of it because, like, there's so many non-starters. Like, I've tried to talk to my wife about Malazan so many times, and it's not doable if someone hasn't read it. So 100%. I'm glad I can be your catharsis.
And I've talked before, the main show, it's like a different thing. It's like, at this point, I don't really feel like I'm holding back that much because it's not like me and you were sitting here talking about specific plot beats and stuff, right. But anyway, let's steer back to Bone Hunters. We started.
Yeah, I think this is like 40% of this. We've talked about Bone Hunters, and then the other 60%.
But that's how these podcasts are. Really, they're just somewhat related, you know. So, what do you? 2 quick questions. Did you read? When did you read Return of the Crimson Guard? And then number 2, if you read it. And then number 2, what do you make of the ending of this book with Lacine and the whole Malaz City finale?
So Return of the Crimson Guard, literally, I am 100 pages from the end of that right now on my first reread.
Oh, first reread.
No, sorry, first read. So this is, I'm literally in the midst of Return of the Crimson Guard. I have a lot of thoughts on that. So I did not read it like with the main 10. I was definitely one of those people who were like, I want to read the main 10, then I'll do the spinoffs. Which after reading Return of the Crimson Guard, I'm going to double down on that recommendation because I am not a huge fan of Return of the Crimson Guard. I think the story is interesting. The execution, in my view, is very poor.
I think it's a great book, but it's certainly messy. It is a messy
If
book.
I think if it was like 500 pages, it'd be pretty good. But it's just, okay, I'll give you my 60-second thoughts are that Ian Esselmont is trying to be Steven Erikson in that book. He's not being Ian Esselmont. And I don't think he can do it. He's not Steven Erikson, so he's not going to do the Steven Erikson thing well. I've heard from several people that when he sort of embraces his own style, he is very, very good as a writer for what he does. And he obviously has he's a good writer. I mean, very obviously he's a very interesting, creative, I love the way he talks about stuff, but he's not Steven Erikson, and he's trying to do the Steven Erikson thing, and Crimson Garden doesn't quite work. That's my 60-second thought.
Fully agree. Here's another 60 seconds on it.
Okay.
When one of those, me and Iskar talked about it, and we both like the book, but definitely its weakness is that the decision to go from Night of Knives, 2 people doing 2 things in one night, to let's have 50 people doing 50 things, and then at the end they're all going to explode at the same time, Yeah. And a bunch of plates end up smashing on the ground, and the juggling does not pull off. So I agree, but
go ahead.
The only reason I asked was because this is why I looped back into the Malaz City thing, because we're talking about bone hunters here.
Yep. We really are.
This is kind of the last scene stuff, unless you go off and read some of the spin-off stuff, which I was glad I ended up doing, because that was important to me, those Malazan politics. But I wonder what you make of this last Lacine stuff, and where you end up walking away thinking about her in general in the series.
Yeah, so again, this is sort of fresh in my mind because I just finished the big battle where the Seti abandoned the Confederacy in Crimson Guard. So sorry if I just ruined Crimson Guard for somebody, but so it's very fresh in my mind, the whole politics of Kantali and what's happening there. And I think it's very interesting what's happening there because it explains more the end of this book. To answer your question directly, I like that Lacine, who should be a main character, just isn't. And Erikson refuses to make her a main character, refuses to explain to you the levers of power, the pressures she's under, why she can't do any of this, just focuses on Tavor and what this means for Tavor and the Bone Hunters. So I appreciate that. The end of this book is kind of crazy. All of a sudden, just the Claw are going nuts and you're running around Malaz City and Kalam dies. All this kind of weird stuff just kind of happens. And then they're going off on the sail ship. I'm actually forgetting. Is this where does she give the speech of being forgotten or not remembering in this book, or is that in Reaper's Gale?
Who?
Not Lacine, Tavor. Does she give her Bone Hunter speech in this book or the next book?
I don't know what speech you're talking about, but I don't remember it in this book. So, but unless I'm just turned around.
What does she say? That they're the forgotten, or they're the nameless? I forget. But I think it must be in Reaper's Gale. But basically, my thoughts on Lacine is that she is not that important to this story, which is weird, but I like.
Yeah, it's interesting because I agree, and I think it really threw me off the first time reading it, because especially because I went from Game of Thrones, which is so soaked with court drama, to reading these books. So when it's there's Lacine and she betrayed the Emperor, and she's kind of the villain of Gardens of the Moon. She's kind of the big bad in Gardens of the Moon in a way. You're wow, she's going to be a major character in this story. And she's a somewhat important character, but really she's a minor character overall.
Yeah. And in this book, the reason I was so excited at the end of Bone Hunters, I remember was okay, now I'm finally going to get it, right? All right, what the fuck, Lacine? Tell me why you did this to the Bridge Burners, or did you do this to the Bridge Burners? Was it an accident? I'm expecting, even though I shouldn't expect by this point, the scene where they talk about everything, but it never happens. It's all sort of unsaid, or, Tavor reports to her, and then all hell breaks loose. And that's it. There's not that scene.
Yeah. What is funny is I do think in some ways For me, the Malaz City finale is kind of just like nothing. I don't care about it. And I mean, it's fine and all, but I think what strikes me as surprising is I think this whole book is really one of the most straightforward books in the whole series. You know, basically there's a plot and you're going to get what you kind of think you're going to get, and it kind of goes through all the beats, and then by the end of it you kind of got there, you know? And here's what I want to contrast it to. The end of House of Chains, which I don't like, and many people find anticlimactic. You know, I think this is a thing people feel like it's like, oh, and then kind of nothing happens. You know?
Yeah.
And then other people are like, well, that's the point. It's blah, blah, blah. You know? And, you know, God bless. But House of Chains, if you look at some of the other books, I would point to, I think Reaper's Gale somewhat, have endings that kind of swerve away from what you thought we were going to do, and we end up somewhere else. Or that we end up in the place maybe, but like we took a weird route to get there. You know, and if you contrast it to a book like this, where, you know, early on, they're like, well, we're going to go to Yucatan and have a battle. They go to Yucatan, there's a battle. Oh, it's a bit different than you thought, but basically they fight the people and that's the thing, you know? And then they're like, we're going to go to Malaz City and confront Lacine. And I don't know. I don't think I was surprised at all at ever reading this book, except from when the Eater showed up and I realized that I like stepped outside of the moment for 1 second to think about the book in a greater context. I was like, oh yeah, I guess they're going to be in the story too, you know?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. It is a very straightforward, like the only really like rope-a-dope as far as the ending is that there is no like real explanation or like, you know, confrontation of Lacine. It's just kind of like, oh no, the Empire's changed, we're getting out. But like even that's not, it just happens and then the ending happens.
So this time standing out to me, another thing that really stood out was the Hiboric stuff, which I think the first time through, that stuff just makes no sense. And I'm just like a big shrug, like, I guess so.
Mm-hmm.
But this time, I'm like, damn, I wish the whole book was about this. Do you know what I mean? Or just like, can we talk more about Hiboric for once? You know? Because I think it's weird, because he shows up later, and even when he shows up later, he's not even that. He's just kind of around, you know? But I feel like he should be more important than he is, you know?
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this question. What is Hiboric like? What's his function here? Because you're right, he's not like a major character, but he does keep popping up. And so Erickson like is putting him in front of the reader a lot. I'm curious, because I haven't reread the books. And for me, the first round was exactly as you described, right? It's all just like, what the hell, jade statues, you know, going to space and hearing voices, blah, blah, blah. Like, why is he put in front of us as the reader as much as he is? Because I agree he's fascinating, but I still don't really know, I think, why in my head.
To me, he's a character, and of course his roles as both a priest and historian belie this, in that he is someone that often brings people out of their own perspective, and especially in conversations with Felicin and Deadhouse Gates, and then with Crocus and Cutter in books 4 and 6. In book 6. He is someone I feel that is often taking narrators that are often young people who have not, or who aren't thinking outside of themselves, and are trying to bring them out into the rest of the world and into history or into faith, and into the metaphysical. So I think that's kind of how I conceptualize his character. And then there's just also a bunch of these like plot elements layered onto it that is like a hat on a hat on a hat on a hat.
Right.
No, I've always found something charming about it. And then with the Jade stuff just remains unknowable, you know, which I just far prefer.
And he is the one, right, with his hands that actually brought Fenrir into the physical world. Is that how that worked? Or am I missing?
Yeah, that's in book 2, though, right?
Yeah, but that I think has repercussions in Crippled God, because Fenrir is the one, obviously, that he's able to die, and so the blood and all that. Now we are talking spoilers for everything, but it is interesting that, like, you're right, like as a mentor, like that character makes sense, But then also tacked on is this crazy shit Jade stuff with the crippled god, and that he's a priest of Fenrir that brought, like, there's so much weird stuff to him that does make him that sort of like mysterious figure as well. Not just like, I don't know, a Gandalf or something.
Yeah, well, I think he's more. Well, the last thing I want to touch on here before we kind of wrap up is the First Throne storyline.
Yeah.
Which is the only, like, I feel everything else in this book is like fairly focused on the Bone Hunters.
Right.
Even the Apsalar stuff, she ends up spending time with them. Perrin's around, but Perrin's story still feels weaved into the greater Seven Cities story. How do you think about this incident at the First Throne and Icarium? And I don't know, do you walk away feeling like that's something you remember in this book, or?
I don't think, when I think about the Icarium storyline, I don't think of like one book in particular because it's so sprinkled throughout all of them. So to be honest,
agreed.
Like, because is this where Tarlak Veed first shows up, or is he there before?
Yeah, this is when Tarlak Veed takes control.
Yeah,
so to speak.
I agree. I think you talked about it in one of your nearest podcasts that like everyone hates him, and I totally agree. The spitting with the hair thing is disgusting.
But he's the best. He's one of the best characters. He's one of the most fun villains, you know?
Yeah. He hams it up quite a lot, which is always fun. But so yeah, the Icarium stuff, I don't specifically like. I don't think Bone Hunters and I think Icarium, but I think like his constant wandering, especially now that Mappo is not away from him, especially now knowing the ending of all of those storylines, which is somewhat unfulfilling. I think not in a bad way. I think in a good way. The Icarium, how Icarium sort of ends and Mappo doesn't really unite with him. It's so interesting because that's such a focus of the next couple of books. Not a focus, but like it's always there. It's always there. It's always there. And there's no, I don't know if redemption is the right word. There's no like satisfying ending to that, which I think is fine. I think that's actually quite a beautiful way to do that. But I don't know. It's not specific in Bone Hunter, so I don't really have a clear answer for that. The First Throne thing is also fascinating, I think, because I know how that ends in that like weird trick of the illusion of the throne, right? And so that there's going to be all this terrible stuff that happens, and in the end, it's going to be Killenved doing some kind of trickery that like ends this conflict after so much blood. So that is a storyline that kind of like loses a little bit of something in retrospect because I think the ending is sort of, I don't know, it's not cheap, but I just know that it doesn't.
No, I agree. One of the things, Daniel Green put out some video talking about his thoughts on the whole series finale and how everything goes, And an analogy he used, which I was interesting to think about, was he said that it is not Marvel where all the plot threads are going to come together and tie neatly together, which is something I really agree with. I mean, and it has been true since book one, which is both, I think it ultimately because I don't know. There's pros and cons. One of the pros is that Erickson's following things thematically through. He's picking things that are important, and he's trying to tell things with purpose, and he's leaving things behind that he doesn't need anymore. And some stories are only so long, and they don't need to be that long, so that's a strong choice. But, there's certainly just some storylines throughout the 10 books, the 3 million words or so, that kind of just show up and then kind of just fizzle off into nothing.
Yep.
And there is a certain just like unsatisfying element to that. And I certainly feel like that storyline is just one of those that it's like, yeah, and then that kind of just goes away. Don't worry about it. We're doing other stuff now.
Right. And I think there's also the opposite of that, where there's like storylines that start really fizzly, but then like have a great ending, which I think the Shake is a great example of that, right? Like
great example
in Reaper's Gale, and however much they show up in like Dust of Dreams, I'm just like, oh my God.
You're like, what are we doing?
So for sure, I don't care why Queen of whatever the fuck. But then like the ending of that in Crippled God is some of my favorite shit ever. Like that, it's just like a fantastic ending that also, unbeknownst to any of us, wraps up the whole Tisti and D story maybe not wraps up completely, but like does a pretty good job at that, which is something that's been, totally on the other side of, we didn't know that was going to happen. And so it is, so maybe to plug myself in that postmodernism and post-structuralism video, this is like part of that idea of post-structuralism that is pushing against sort of the traditional organization of narratives, that they have to check off gun things, so to speak, in the sense of like every element of a story is important for the story that you are telling. And in some ways, Erikson is trying to have it both ways, which I think is an interesting experiment, because there is an overarching story for sure that ends, I think, in a very satisfying way. But there are also, as you say, those various elements that don't really affect that overall story at all. But they're also important because of the perspective that we give to it, right? Like the first throne thing to me is not that interesting. But like if you put yourself in the mind of one of those children that's fighting, like that's the most important part of these books. You know what I mean? And it's coming back to that sort of point of view and how we relate importance to what's happening based on our perspective, which I think is fascinating.
And to build to it as well, I mean, listen, I mentioned it's unsatisfying, but that doesn't mean, like, I think often it's important in a short-term thematic sense, and it moves on. And it's also just kind of real life. I mean, things are transient. People are in your life for a bit. People go away. Things are there. I mean, what was important to you 10 years ago is probably not going to climax into some big part of your life right now. Mm-hmm. It could. Some things do, but not all things. Some things you work a job for 6 months, and that's your entire existence there. Do you know what I mean? It's just that. However, on a narrative function, it can be unsatisfying. And I don't think it's, we can recognize that, and that's, have that recognition. But to go what you're saying, to touch on this post-structuralist point, to tie it back to the beginning of talking about the structure of this book in some way. Mm-hmm. I was just talking to a friend about this, in that, this rhythm of stories, this structure of your typical story is just so in our bones. Mm-hmm. We're like, it's just there from our childhood. It's just in everything we see, boom, 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 these certain beats, how things work. So whenever any story really veers off this path, and just is doing a separate thing, it's working with a different structure, it like instantly, you can feel it in your body. You're like, you feel untethered. You don't know what's happening. You're like, shouldn't there be rising action here? What's going on? You know what I mean? Like, and not that that's inherently wrong. It's like, fine, of course, lots of stories I love are breaking from this structure. But there's also this unknown element, which is kind of how I've always viewed as you're kind of playing with fire in a way, because I don't think anything's wrong with this typical structure. Lots of stories I love and stories I think are great are, right on the rails, But when you go off it, there is this like, okay, well, you have to build a structure that's going to deliver something just as satisfying as doing the normal stuff, And I think about when you're untethered and, we're building something kind of wholly new, we're playing with a new type of structure, there is just a more volatile element here. And I don't think this book totally collapses under creating that new structure. I just think it builds a very funky looking structure that is, Erikson calls it 2 books put together. I don't know if I would I don't know if I would call it that, but I do get what he's getting at. It is a kind of bifurcated story. So it's a very weird book in some ways, and not in other ways where it's like, I think House of Chains is a very weird book. I just think Bone Hunters, what's this? I don't know.
That's a great ending to that monologue. Bone Hunters, what's this? But I think that's fascinating, because the point that post-structuralism is making of structuralism is not that structures are bad, but that structures are imposed by those who approach the story, whether that's the author or the reader. And it's interesting that a book like this that doesn't have a traditional structure, we still have to talk about how we view the structure. Like in this discussion we've had, whether it is Erikson's view as the author, that it's kind of like 2 books in one, whether it's what you just described as like this sort of like very A to B, you kind of get what you expect structure, or this, wildly divergent series of smaller structures. Like all of them, we are imposing on what we hear because we are story making beings. That would be what a post-structuralist would say, and I think is interesting about this discussion. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
Okay, and I think that's, in a philosophical and sort of metaphysical way, it's interesting because that is also how we live our actual lives. There's no real, sorry to break it to everybody, there's no real like structure in the world.
What?
Like it's maybe this is my own personal bias maybe, but like it's mostly chaos, but we build our own structures inside of it, our own stories inside of it. If I asked anyone to tell me about their childhood, they would probably like tell me a cohesive narrative where like it really wasn't, you know what I mean? And so I think that's the interesting reflection on these more post-structuralist stories, is that you as the reader are left to impose that structure. And just like, I mean, at the beginning, before we even talked about any of this stuff, you asked like, Bone Hunters, what do you remember about it? And then I gave sort of the structure of how I see it in the whole series. But that's me reading into it in my experience in a lot of different ways, which I think it's just a fascinating way that somehow I think Erikson has done this really, really well, where both of those things are possible at the same time. When you asked me that question, I talked about how I saw the structure of the series as a whole and how I saw, the Bone Hunters do that. But when I described that, I wasn't thinking at all of Icarium or this First Throne discussion, or even some of the more minor like discussions of the regulars, which is a large part of this book. But I am imposing the structure as I understand it. I think that's a really interesting point that Erikson somehow is able to kind of sneak in while also telling like a very interesting story.
Well, Andy, thank you for coming on the show today. If you want to check out some more Andy Smith's thoughts about Malazan or other books, you can check out the links in our episode description. I'm sure I'll be back someday. Let us know what you think of the show at 10 Very Big Books on Twitter and Gmail. Andy, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, it was a delight. Thanks for having me. It was really cool. I've been listening to the show since the beginning. Excited other people are, and pumped to be on the show.
It was great to have you on, and it was a great discussion. I really got a lot out of it. It was a lot of fun. And if you stay after the music, me and Andy are briefly going to talk about the Stormlight Archives, as I said. So.
Oh, that was real. I'm very excited now.
All right. Once again, AJ, play us out. We have to get to Witness 2, which is something we're going to record separately right after this. But I essentially don't talk about the Stormlight Archive, just would love to hear some big picture thoughts, what you think about this series. I picked up Rhythm of War, never read it, but it's around in my life.
Yeah, mine is bookshelf over there, still haven't read it. I think Brandon Sanderson tells cool stuff. Those stories are way too long and are super thin thematically. That's my 10-second thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I fairly. It's funny. It's kind of funny in that I feel like I started this podcast when I am the least interested in fantasy I've ever been. And that's just my candid feeling. And I think here's an example. I read those books, and what's tough is I sometimes I don't know if I'm losing interest in genre fiction or it's just the fiction I'm reading, and it's almost certainly the latter, right? I'm sure there's some great books out there I just haven't picked up. And I got to tell you, it doesn't help that nowadays the only English books I read are the Malazan Book of the Fallen, So it's this, I live in this weird world where I'm just only reading Japanese, and then when I read the written word in English, it's Malazan. So it's a funky feeling. But anyway, I think those Stormlight books are pretty good. I've never read anything else by the dude. And frankly, there's too much. I'm not going to read it all. Nice try. I'm not going to, too much. Yeah. But like sometimes I'm there and I'm just like, guy, I don't need to hear about all this stuff. He's like trying to tell me about, like, I don't know how something works in the world. And I'm like, I don't care. Next, move on, please.
I think I would have a very mild take about these books if it wasn't like the biggest selling fantasy series in the world. I just don't understand. There's some cool elements of it. I like some of the characters. I mean, I've read 3,000 pages of it, so obviously there's something in it that I find somewhat interesting and like, pleasurable. But like the fact that it is the one thing that gets, I don't know, a Fortnite character or whatever the fuck, like that, like it's everywhere. I just don't understand. It's just not to the level of excellence that I would understand it having that sort of platform.
Here's what I'll say. You called it light thematically, which I would broadly agree with. So me and Josh studied classical music together, right? And, classical musicians and classical composers have some pretty serious opinions about music, as you can imagine, and some of them are pretty elitist, And some people would always be like, modern music, pop music, it's like not as sophisticated, it's not good music, it's not like, Mahler, it's not Stromberg, whatever. And I always thought this was a fucking stupid opinion. I always found it extremely dumb. Listen, Schoenberg's great. I love Schoenberg. However, people love Bruce Springsteen. And, there's a commercial element to it. There's a capital element to it. But obviously, people love his music. Thousands and thousands of people have been deeply emotionally moved and had their lives changed by his music. Is it sophisticated? No, it's not actually that complicated a music. Like if we wanted to break out the charts, it's not a lot going on. However, it's obviously deeply affecting to people. And that's like, do I think Brandon Sanderson's a particularly good writer? Do I think his sentence, like, how you read some sentences and you're just like, man, crazy good sentence. I couldn't have done that if I tried. Like this author's just on the next level. No, I don't think that when I'm reading his work. I'm just like, okay, he's doing it, But like, obviously, he can put together a fucking book and he can put it together well. And I enjoy reading it. And I don't think the prose is like gonna change your life. I don't think it's particularly poetic and I don't think it's particularly moving. But like, as you said, like I pretty much enjoy reading his books and he like knows how to put it together. So I would never be one to knock him for not knowing how to put together a book. Because God knows I could not do it. Like, he knows how to do it. And a lot of people think so. But it is kind of funny. It's like the biggest one all the time.
Yeah, I wish I knew what that was. You know what I mean? Like, I wish I knew why the people liked this Bruce Springsteen as opposed to like Robin Hobb or I like Steven Erickson. I kind of understand because it is sort of a.
And listen, I think Steve knows this. He's not. It's an acquired taste. It's an acquired taste.
Yeah, I understand that, but like there are other voices out there that I think are a little bit more digestible that just do things a little better. But whatever. Power to them. And I have read. I should say for people who are going to get not upset. Well, there's always Sanderson people who get upset about this. I have read all the Cosmere, so it's not like I don't have street cred in the Brandon Sanderson area. I've read it all. Don't tell me to read Elantris.
I would be interested in reading some of the other stuff. I just resent this idea that I remember reading Stormlight Archives, and I think between 2 or 3 or between 3 and 4, they were like, you should read this short story or novella. And I resent this. Like I'm reading. I should be able to read these 10 books and have the total experience. Do you know what I mean? That's my point of view. In my mind, if you can't read the 10 books in the 10 book series and not have a total experience, there is a fundamental failing going on.
Yep.
But anyway, I really loved Way of Kings. If kind of have been less impressed since then. Looking forward to getting a Warbreaker eventually. But as I mentioned, I just don't read that many English books.
You should get it in Japanese just to continue
I don't know if there is a Japanese translation of it. I know they translated some of them, but anyway, interesting guy. But I think it seems like he's going to be around for a while.
I would imagine so. If someone out there is listening and really wants to see someone lay into Brandon Sanderson, I have a 25-minute rant review on Oathbringer on my channel, which is the third book. I really didn't like that one. The first two I actually liked quite a bit with some problems. The third one I thought had a lot of bad elements to it. So if you really want to see some harsh thoughts on Stormlight Archive, go knock yourself out.
Yeah, I definitely like the first two more than the third, but I'm gonna read the fourth, but we'll see if I'm in no rush. We got time.
And
the thing is, and you talked about why is he the one who broke so big? I think in somewhat it's because there's just such a commercial element now, and he's just like working like a machine. He writes so many books, and now there's this whole interconnected thing. He has such a big social media presence. Honestly, it's just like he's building this brand. He's managed this brand. I think it's a huge part of the success.
And he's an incredible, like, nice guy. Like, I watch like his videos. I've seen the interviews. I saw him at a conference once. Like, he seems like a generally really great guy. And especially for someone who is a Mormon to have like gay characters in his books, I think is pretty cool. But anyway, I don't know what I'm saying here, but nice guy.
I didn't know there were that many gay characters in his books, but
there's not that. There's one, which is one more than I thought that a practicing Mormon would have.
Yeah.
So, you know,
and I do know he's serious about his faith. No, I mean, listen, I'm not really here to tear him down. As I said, I feel like you got to give it to him, and I like what I've read. I just don't, no. So anyway, that was a little bonus talk.
That's our ending on Stormlight.
All right, see ya.
All right, yep, that's it.